What the Waorani people have been teaching us is about valuing life and living systems. And our economic structures, our trade structures, our tax structures, our treaties need to value life and living systems. So we don't have all the answers, but real reconciliation and decolonization is about listening and about trying to figure out new answers. And that's what we're going to be trying to do.
Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo. Bring you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet, and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today on the newscast, I bring you Mongabay's coverage of the recent Climate Week in New York City, an extensive week-long event attended by leaders, experts, journalists, and activists working in the climate and environmental spaces. While heavily focused on addressing climate change, many panels and events featured discussions on Indigenous rights and conservation for tropical forested nations. Experts from African and Amazon nations spoke with me about their work, and I got to interview a policy expert working on the Global Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a global agreement to mandate a phase-out of fossil fuels. My colleagues and I attended and spoke at a number of events highlighting the importance of independent environmental news. We also saw speakers such as Johan Rockström discuss planetary boundaries, Waorani leader Naamante Nkeimo, and the Rainforest Action Network. There was a ton to see and do, but my first stop on the trip was a roundtable at the UN Summit of the Future 2024 at the Virgin Hotel on Broadway. The following are brief clips from that roundtable featuring three speakers. Their remarks about the need for an overhaul of our global financial systems were shared by many at the conference, but I thought their summaries were quite prescient of the challenges nations face that are heavily impacted by climate change. First, you're going to hear from Mohamed Nasheed, the former president of the Maldives.
It's time to embrace new adaptation strategies. Nature-based, soft and biological solutions. We must lead with innovative thinking and science, making a last-ditch effort to preserve what we can of the world's ecosystems. Debt relief is also critical for climate vulnerable countries. Nations like Seychelles, Belize, and Barbuda have pioneered debt for nature swaps. In 2018, Seychelles became the first country to successfully undertake such a swap to protect its oceans. This model can and should be scaled globally. The global financial system is fundamentally flawed, diverting resources from the countries that need them most. In 2023, international private lenders collected 68 billion more in repayments from developing countries than they lent. And international financial institutions extracted 40 billion, while in concessional assistance, they gave 4 billion. This forces developing countries to cut essential spending on health, education, and infrastructure. Half of the world's poorest nations are now worse off than before the pandemic, highlighting the urgent need for financial systems reform. We need fairer financial flows that empower local and regional institutions. Adaptation finance is severely underfunded, making up less than 10% of global climate finance. While local communities in vulnerable countries are on the front lines, only a small fraction of adaptation funding reaches them. We must reform the modalities and processes for funding deployment, ensuring that the most vulnerable countries and communities receive the resources they need.
Next, Paul Chet Greene, the foreign minister for Antigua and Barbuda, opined that GDP is not a measure of a nation's ability to withstand climate shocks, and he instead endorsed the Multidimensional Volatility Index.
We must ensure that human well-being and ecological stability are seen as mutually reinforcing, not as separate or competing goals. This is why Antigua and Barbuda forces have been strong advocates for the Multi-Dimensional Vulnerability Index, the MDI. This is because the MDI shifts the narrative by recognizing that the GDP alone is not an adequate measure of a country's ability to withstand external shocks. Cities are highly vulnerable to linked environmental and social risks that are not captured by traditional financial indicators. The MDI deposit offers a fair vulnerability assessment, ensuring that small climate vulnerable nations like ours receive international support, very much needed to build resilience and to reduce inequality.
While there were a lot of speakers to record at this panel, I found Amitabh Behar, the executive director of Oxfam, to have some quite substantive remarks that summarized many thoughts shared. These were a common theme throughout this conference. He spoke about the underlying problem of the polycrisis, how we think of that term itself, and what the solution to the central crisis facing the planet is. Listen here to his words.
In the last couple of years, we've been using this phrase, the polycrisis. And when we talk of polycrisis, we're talking of the climate crisis, the food crisis, the crisis of democracy, which is essentially our plutocracies. It goes on. However, I would actually submit that this is not a polycrisis. It is essentially multiple manifestations of the same crisis. And I think that fundamental shift needs to be made. And that's when we can get into a systems changing approach. What is that fundamental crisis? I think we are very clear that it is this neoliberal economic order, which is built on essentially extraction, exploitation, greed, and conquest. So that's what this system is doing, and it is doing this at the cost of humans and the planet.
On Sunday, I saw a short documentary called PLANETWALKER about the life of activist John Francis. After witnessing the 1971 San Francisco Bay oil spill, Francis took an oath of silence and refused to use a car, and he journeyed across the United States on foot. And he did this for decades. At one point, Francis stopped in Madison, Wisconsin to earn a PhD. It's a powerful short film that highlights a crucial environmental activist continuing his legacy by traversing the African continent from Cape Town to Cairo. Here I interviewed Allison Begalman, who was present to help promote the film. Allison, thank you for speaking with me. Can you just give our listeners a breakdown of the movie we just watched?
Yeah, of course. So PLANETWALKER is a short documentary film about Dr. John Francis, who is an environmentalist who witnessed the San Francisco Bay oil spill in 1971 and was so affected by it that he ended up walking across the United States for about 17 years. And he also stopped speaking or using motorized transport fully. And he really inspired a whole movement of people in terms of walking and climate, and also, racial justice and climate. And notably, he took a detour and got a PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and wrote his dissertation on oil spills, right? Yes, he ended up working with the Coast Guard. They said, okay, come whenever you want. They left an office open for him, and he walked there, and he was working with them and sort of putting the face to oil spills, which we didn't really have before in the U.S., especially being a black man in that time was very, very, very powerful description for politicians who were working in the White House.
Something that really moved me during this movie was that he said how we treat the environment is how we treat each other. And it was so powerful. Do you have any reflections on that? Like, what do you think is resonating here with other people?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my role in this work is that I'm supporting the filmmakers Nadia and Dom Gill, who are incredible, and of course Dr. Francis in the Impact Campaign. So I'm helping sort of channel the film into grassroots organizing work to make sure that it's really getting out to the right communities and supporting folks. And I think it's really affecting, it's a film that can affect a lot of different types of people with different views, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or whatever race or gender you are, because it really is about people and how it is a human problem, climate, and so many other issues, and also how climate is a very intersectional issue. And I think that's, along with many other things, especially the fact that he was a walker, because Nadia and Dom, the filmmakers, were also huge bikers. They biked across the country. They're outdoor and environmentalists. So, that drew them to this story. And I think the beauty of it is that anyone can be outside and be outdoors and experience nature, and that can shift anyone's perspective. I think that's something that the filmmakers and audiences are really galvanizing around for the film.
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful. So in your remarks after the movie, you said he's walking from Cape Town to Cairo. What's this for? Tell us all about it.
I mean, I think he walks because it is important to him it's part of his nature at this point to be walking, to be connecting with nature. He's very present at every step of the way. And so it's really important for him to just keep doing this. So he stopped for a while, and he had kids, he had a family, and now he's back out on the road. Obviously, he is 78, so he has to take breaks at points, but it's still really impregnable. And I think we're just looking to have people meet him on the road and then help document his story and hopefully get more people out on there, because the people he's meeting there, he's affecting their lives just by connecting with them and building community. So I think we're just looking to help. Bee's looking to help inspire a new movement of environmentalism, and then folks who really haven't gotten involved before really appreciate the beauty of nature and Mother Earth.
Is there a website or anything that more people can go to get more information?
Yeah, of course. You can go to www.planetwalkerfilm.com, where you can also go to Instagram at planetwalkerfilm, and there's ways to learn more. You can donate to the Impact Campaign and learn more about just the work that John is doing with his organization, Planet Walker.
Allison, thank you so much. I appreciate you speaking with me.
Thank you.
Later, I attended a lunch gathering with African conservation and climate organizations. This event focused on exploring how to get funding to local people from philanthropies. I reported on this common complaint and problem at length during the Congo Basin series for Mongabay Explorers, episode 5. During this panel, I spoke with Luisa Castaneda, the deputy director of the organization Land is Life, whose organization is campaigning for better inclusion of Indigenous perspectives and rights at the next Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Forest Tenure Funding Pledge at COP30 in Brazil. The original occurred at COP26 in Glasgow, and as of 2022, this pledge notably had only dispersed 7% of the funding directly to Indigenous groups, as Mongabay's John Cannon reported. So Castaneda spoke to me about improving this on the following pledge. Luisa, thank you for speaking with me. You work for Land is Life, correct?
Yes, Mike, I work for Land is Life. That is an organization that works on advancing Indigenous people rights around the world.
And so you wanted to tell me something about a funding pledge that was made at Glasgow and a follow-up to it. What is this?
The funder, the Forest Tenure Funder Group at the COP26 in Glasgow, they made a pledge supporting Indigenous peoples and local communities for $1.7 billion for 5 years. And this pledge is ending next year. And this was a very important pledge because it's the first time that philanthropy and some private organizations and funders, even governments like USA, are supporting and aiming to support directly to Indigenous peoples. And this was very positive, and it was welcomed by Indigenous peoples as an advance on this direct funding support. Now they are preparing the second pledge that might be launched next year at the COP30 in Brazil, in Belém. As I mentioned, it was very important for Indigenous peoples, but we believe that more things can be done in a better way to make sure Indigenous peoples have a seat in the discussion and they can be part of the decisions and guiding all the process that this group of funders and philanthropists are talking about.
And what are some of those things that you think, more things that you think could be done?
One of the things is that this pledge is focused on tropical forest. That means that only in Indonesia, in Asia, the Congo Basin in Africa, and the Amazon in Latin America, like within these geographical sculptures, are the only indigenous people who are receiving the funding. And as you might know, and we know this very well, climate change is impacting indigenous people all over the world. The Arctic people and the indigenous people in the Arctic are being impacted. Also, the Amazon relies on the Andes, and we know that sub-Saharan desert also is connected to the Amazon. So one of the recommendations that indigenous peoples are making to in the ahead of this second pledge is that the funding should go to indigenous peoples in all these 7 socio-cultural regions. That means the Arctic, North America, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific, Asia, Central Asia, to all these regions.
And is there anything else, any other demands that or recommendations that you have that are central?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that 45 indigenous peoples organizations from Asia, the Pacific, Africa, the Arctic, and Latin America co-signed a list of recommendations directed to these philanthropy groups, advising that it's very important to advance to indigenous people, and they are ready to guide them and to be at the table discussing this. And one of the important things is self-determination. Most of the philanthropy is dedicated, or their efforts, in tenure rights. For indigenous people, tenure rights are so important, but it's not only the efforts that they need to. We need to focus on self-determination. And it's because the fact that they might have tenure rights, it doesn't mean that they can freely occupy these ancestral territories. And you have many experiences when, even though they have tenure rights, these indigenous people are not being able to occupy these territories and continue protecting conservation and their biodiversity. On the other hand, it's about indigenous women. They are the protectors of biodiversity. They are the bearers of knowledge that have been able to keep this biodiversity ecosystem. So it's like how indigenous women are part of the conversation. So our invite is that indigenous peoples can be at the table with the philanthropies, constructing together how this Pledge 2.0 will look like.
Is there a website or any information that people who want to learn more about this can go to?
Yeah, of course. We have the recommendation in our website, landislife.org. So you are welcome to visit the website, to read the recommendation. If you are indigenous people's organization interested in co-signing these recommendations, we are welcoming. But also we want to make sure these recommendations that were sent to the philanthropy groups are really listening, and we can be discussing with them.
Luisa, thank you so much for speaking with me. At the same luncheon and panel on funding pledges in practice, I spoke with Sam Shaba, the CEO of Honey Guide, a conservation organization working in Tanzania that runs and manages community-protected areas. Shaba talked with me about the success he's had with this model and how other conservation NGOs can more effectively court funding, and what philanthropists and funders should really consider changing about their own practices as well. Thanks for speaking with me, Sam. Can you introduce yourself and the organization you work for and where you work?
So I'm Sam Shaba, the CEO of Honey Guide Foundation. We are based in Arusha, Tanzania. And what we do is to make it possible for people to live with wildlife outside state-owned national parks.
And so when you were talking in the panel, you mentioned that before you received opposition from conservation, from communities, but now presumably you don't. So what was the switch that happened? What changed?
So we still have opposition in new areas where we got to work, and it's understandable opposition. This idea of community conservation in Tanzania started 2 decades ago, when the government allowed people to register a wildlife area outside state control. And since then, the promise was that these people will make money out of it and they will make a livelihood out of it. That hasn't happened for most of these communities for 2 decades. So it's understandable when you go to this area and you say, hey, I'm a conservation NGO. I want to enable conservation in your area. Those people say, why care? We don't want conservation in our area. Conservation means more attacks to our livelihood. Conservation means more attacks to us. So it's understandable because they don't see the value of having wildlife on their neighborhood.
But they see the value now, correct?
In the areas where it has been successful, it's areas where we made it valuable to have wildlife on their land. And value in those areas would come from, looking at a business perspective, would come from either they are making money out of it or the non-monetary things that they've secured because of conservation. So we know examples in northern Tanzania where just securing that land for grass, for those agro-pastoralist communities has mattered. We know places where value meant making significant amount of money that they didn't make otherwise. We've worked in communities where they were not making any money from conservation. Now they're making $1 million a year to enable those operational expenses of keeping conservation, but also to bring some value to their livelihood. They invested in education, they invest in health, they invest in their businesses, they invest in growing their community.
You talked a lot about the importance of communicating impact, so I wanted to give you a little bit of a microphone here to communicate that. What can you summarize? What's been your impact?
Our impact is that first, the very big thing is we've proven a model that community conservation can work, and it takes 3 to 5 years to make it work. In Tanzania, it's possible, it has been done, and we did it in 2 places. We're now scaling up to over 15 places. That's one. The second thing is that impact means, in most times, like actual monetary gains. It means revenues. It means making money out of conservation. We have enabled projects like carbon projects where people who had a forest and the forest was slowly disappearing are now conserving the forest because that forest brings actual carbon revenues. Speak about climate change. Those people are protecting the future.
But in addition to just being paid to keep the forest in the ground for the carbon revenues, people are living off this money though, correct? Like they are thriving, correct?
Yes, people are thriving from having better education. People are thriving from having better health. People are thriving from having better access to grass because for them, for the communities, for example, in northern Tanzania, grass means life. That's their wealth.
So you talked about the importance of relationships with funders. What is it that attracts a funder to you when they support you? What's their why?
So one is having a very clear vision. What is it that you're promising to achieve? And how long will that take? And how much will that take? And how are you going to tell that you are achieving it? So having that for us meant having a strategic plan that defines a very clear goal. We are trying to make a wildlife management area sustainable, financially, socially, and ecologically. And we will do that in between $600,000 to $1 million. We'll do that in 3 to 5 years. And once done, it's very clear that the community will be making more money. They'll be having value, social value from the area, and the ecosystem will be intact, wildlife will be safe. And we have clear data, clear metrics that we measure every year to show that we're progressing towards that. That's what funders want. It makes it easier for them to trust you.
And just a final question to you, Sam. You were talking about the importance of, actually this entire panel was all about getting money directly, cutting out the bureaucracy. Do you have words for funders out there to support that message?
So one message to funders is take some risk and trust in us, as the risk that most funders are taking in investing in businesses. You don't typically invest in a business and tell them where they can spend or can't spend money. That's not normal, but it's very normal in a conservation landscape. Having restricted funding that says you can only pay for rangers' fuel, and the data that you can report on is number of hours used in patrols, is useless. It doesn't help anyone. It doesn't happen in business. It shouldn't happen in conservation. So the message is take a trust in us, fund us unrestricted, fund our vision and not our projects.
Sam, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you very much.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying listening to everything we covered during Climate Week, and thank you as always for tuning in and listening to the Mongabay Newscast. I just wanted to remind you that if you aren't already subscribed to our show on the podcast platform of your choice, I highly recommend you do so, as that helps support our show and bring it to a wider audience. And it's also just the best way for you to stay up to date on our weekly conversations. But if you prefer to follow us by email, we have a weekly Mongabay newsletter, which you can easily find in the upper right-hand corner of Mongabay's homepage at mongabay.com. That's all for now. Back to Climate Week. I was invited to attend a panel at the World Trade Center which discussed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a proposal for a global treaty that would mandate a phase-out of fossil fuels. And while it's pretty complex, the model on which it is based can be described as similar to another successful treaty like the Montreal Protocol, which effectively curbed the production of CFCs in the 20th century that was eating a hole in the ozone layer. Here, Tzeporah Berman, who is the chair of the treaty, introduces and explains the context regarding its evolution.
We're here today to share with you the growing momentum around the world for a fossil fuel treaty. A fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty is a bold new plan to foster international cooperation between nation states to complement the Paris Agreement by advancing a fast, fair, and financed transition to clean, sustainable energy, to phase out existing production in keeping with an appropriate response to the climate emergency. The campaign for the treaty was inspired by many other treaties that address the threats of landmines, asbestos, ozone-depleting chemicals, and other dangerous threats. The fact is, climate change and climate policy, it's complicated. But what's not complicated is that 86% of the emissions that are trapped in our atmosphere today from carbon that are causing the fires, the floods, the storms, the increase of legal heat humidity around the world come from three things: oil, gas, and coal. And for too long, we've been having these discussions at Climate Week and in international fora and developing agreements to reduce emissions and pollution. But almost behind our backs, the industry has been continuing to grow production. And our governments are continuing to this day to approve more and more projects, licenses of oil, gas, and coal. So right now, the UN production gap report is showing that we're on track to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal by 2030 than we can ever burn if we want to stay below 2 degrees. So we need countries to cooperate in order to create the preconditions possible for a phase out of fossil fuels. And that's what the Fossil Fuel Treaty is about. We have to stop making the problem bigger, because what we build today will be what we use tomorrow. And shockingly, we don't have any agreements between countries on who will produce what fossil fuels, how much, or for how long. So only 2 years ago, a fossil fuel treaty was officially proposed for the first time on the floor of the United Nations by the Pacific Island nation of Vanuatu, followed shortly after by Tuvalu at COP27. Only 2 years ago. Since then, the proposal has quickly gained momentum, with now a bloc of 13 nation states and 4 continents, including Timor-Leste and Colombia, both fossil fuel producing countries, and many other small island developing states, who are now actively leading this global effort to make the treaty a reality. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative has been building a diverse means to help support the governments who are creating this new bold idea, and also to put pressure on governments who are continuing to expand fossil fuel production. So we now have the support of Indigenous nations from across the Amazon and a growing number of Indigenous organizations. More than 3,500 civil society organizations from across the spectrum of groups from around the world in 117 countries now endorse and support the Fossil Fuel Treaty. 3,000 scientists and academics, 101 Nobel laureates, Over 100 cities from Vancouver to Calcutta and now subnationals are joining the call for the fossil fuel treaty. California, one of the largest economies in the world, has passed a motion to support the fossil fuel treaty in the Senate and in the House.
We heard from a slate of panelists, including Juan Bay from the Waorani Indigenous Nation in Ecuador, who just endorsed the treaty.
Waponi paneke, wayo poni mini, waweka poni mini reway, yomo pontenay todo. Muy buenos días, muchas gracias por este espacio. Mi nombre es Juan Bay, soy presidente de la nacionalidad Waorani del Ecuador, Nahue. En el Ecuador.
Hi everybody, he said good morning. My name is Juan Bay. I am the leader of the Nahua, the Norway tribe. Thank you guys for holding space for us.
Bueno, la nacionalidad Waorani viene trabajando, exhibe su territorio hace 6 décadas.
The Waorani Nation has been doing the work in defending the territory for about 6 decades.
Hoy la nacionalidad Waorani ha entendido de que el petróleo es un problema para los pueblos indígenas y un problema para el mundo.
The Waorani Nation understands that fossil fuels are a problem for not only the nation but also for the world.
En vista que este problema del petróleo nos ha unido para que podamos debatir y dar una respuesta pronta.
This issue with the fossil fuels is what unites us and allows us to be able to conversate and debate about this and come to a quicker solution.
La Nahue, desde su territorio, ha estado trabajando y es un hito histórico lo que ha pasado y lo que está pasando en nuestro territorio en el Ecuador y en la Amazonía ecuatoriana.
The struggle is an historic struggle within the Waorani Nation. The wars went on Ecuador and fossil fuels.
En la nacionalidad Waorani, en sí desde su territorio, hace un año llegó a la consulta popular para que el petróleo quede bajo subsuelo porque el país, el mundo, la sociedad ha entendido que el petróleo no es una solución.
Last year in Ecuador, in the Waorani Nation, the Popular Council came to talk about what is going on. And from there, they were able to have a conversation about one of the issues going on with the fossil fuels.
Hoy la nacionalidad Waorani ha marcado y hemos construido desde nuestro territorio una cumbre que fue realizada en la Amazonía ecuatoriana, entendiendo de que la crisis climática nos ha traído de que nosotros podamos como entendernos la lucha histórica que hacemos los pueblos indígenas.
From there, they were able to develop the conversation a little more and be able to understand how the fossil fuels and indigenous communities must struggle against that, right? How they must come together to struggle against the fossil fuels. And that was that's their struggle now. That's what they're working towards.
Bueno, la Nahue en esa cumbre realizada sacó un plan de acción como darle un paso para responder sobre los problemas del petróleo, entendiendo que el petróleo es un problema de crisis climática y entendiendo que para los pueblos indígenas el petróleo, gas, ha sido un problema brutal que hemos venido luchando, que eso ha causado y han llevado a un enfrentamiento tan duro que es la muerte.
The Waorani Nation right now is working on a plan of action to combat that. They're working on a plan of action because they understand that climate change, it has been a struggle for a very long time, and it's going to continue to be a struggle, and therefore they're working on a solution for this as well for the long term.
En el Ecuador, el territorio Waorani, es un hito que hay que entender de que dentro de este Parque Nacional Yasoní, dentro de este territorio Waorani, hemos dicho de que ya no más el petróleo, ya no más gas en nuestro territorio, porque simplemente nos atrae y los pueblos indígenas han estado muriendo día a día con las enfermedades.
So, they understand that in their territory, in the Waorani territory, the fossil fuels have been intervening a lot with this. That has been creating a challenge that essentially beats up to bans in the community. And so this is a struggle that they are still, fighting today.
Ahora, los pueblos Waorani hemos dado un paso más, que está marcado y ahora necesitamos que ustedes, desde este espacio, podamos construir y trabajar un ambiente justo, un mundo justo, pero sin petróleo.
So right now that they are asking for support from everyone, so that we can work together to be able to come up with a solution without the fossil fuels, and it would benefit everybody.
Le queremos llamar a los donantes, a los bancos internacionales que han financiado la destrucción de la naturaleza. Les llamamos que invierta a la protección, a la defensa de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, porque necesitamos garantizar los derechos de los pueblos indígenas para garantizar a la defensa de la naturaleza, y eso significa que no petróleo, queremos un mundo sano, un territorio sano, un agua sano.
So right now, this is a call to all financial institutions, any donors, anybody that finances fossil fuels. This is a call for them to come and to, offer more protection, more finances to the indigenous community to finding a solution to cutting out the fossil fuels and to bringing our cleaner renewable energy and protecting the planet a little better.
En esa cumbre, la NAUE se alió con el Tratado de No Proliferación de Combustibles Fósiles para poder visualizar la lucha desde la Amazonía.
So the Waorani Nation aligned itself with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty because they believe that this is a step forward.
De esa manera poder construir un mundo sano, un mundo sin petróleo, una vida sana de los pueblos indígenas y para el mundo, porque hoy es el momento de que todos pongamos hombros para poder construir y poder garantizar y decirle no combustibles fósiles, no petróleo, no gas en nuestro territorio y en nuestra Amazonía.
So in this way, that this is how we shield the earth, this is how we provide cleaner energy, this is how we end the oppression to the indigenous nations. This is how, working together, we are able to come up with a solution without fossil fuels, without carbon, without oil.
Ahora hemos dado un paso más y ese es el rumbo y ese ejemplo de la lucha.
Now we need to make a step forward towards this advancing in the struggle. And no carbon, no oil, no fossil fuels.
Muchas gracias.
We also heard from Dr. Maria Neira of the World Health Organization, who spoke about the importance of phasing out fossil fuels for planetary health and reducing the incidence of chronic respiratory diseases.
Transitioning away from fossil fuels for the health community means transitioning for more check for healthy people. Anytime we use the combustion of fossil fuels, we are reducing the number of people seeking treatment at the hospital for chronic respiratory diseases or many other diseases that are caused by breathing the toxic air. That is one of the consequences of the combustion of fossil fuels. We are very happy with this collaboration with the Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty. As WHO, we are mobilizing the whole health community globally to make sure that when we use the health argument to convince people that we need to transition in our way as soon as possible, as quick as possible, to clean sources of energy, the ones that are not killing us. We need renewable, clean, sustainable sources of energy to make sure that we will reduce the 7 million premature deaths we have every year. The hospitals that are completely treating patients with chronic respiratory diseases and many other diseases that are now caused by exposure to this air pollution. We can compare as well with what we did with the Tobacco Framework Convention. We want more, we want a treating, we want to make sure that everybody will be able to breathe clean air and to have health, and for that we need a very strong treaty respecting the health of the people.
And then we heard from Susana Muhamad, the Environment Minister of Colombia, another fossil fuel producing nation that has endorsed the treaty. Here, the minister speaks about the importance of debt cancellation to help nations like hers transition justly and quickly. She joined us over Zoom as she was not able to attend in person.
Thank you so much, Tzeporah, and greetings to everybody. we, as Colombia, were one of the early movers in joining the initiative. As a country that depends on the export of fossil fuels, especially coal and oil, we already have scenarios of what this transition means for Colombia as an export country, especially regarding the fiscal income of the government and the stability or balance of trade. And as the transition is moving forward, which help reduce emissions, but we are not dealing with the economic consequences of the transition, especially for oil producers and dependent countries of the exports of fossil fuels. And if we don't address this, then it will be very difficult for the countries to transition, because exactly the financial institutions and international assistance that understand that our stability, macroeconomic stability, depends on the export of fossil fuels, as soon as they see that we're going to replace that export, they will immediately, the credit agencies raise the alarm and the markets raise the alarm that probably we will not be able to pay our debt. And as a highly indebted country as well, this makes our access to capital more expensive, which means that we actually get more difficulties to be able to make the transition. So this is a vicious circle that makes that nobody makes actually the first move to really phase out fossil fuels. And the consequence is that right now what we see is, although we have pledges around the world that emissions will be reduced, that on the demand side technologies are changing, the actual expansion of production of fossil fuels continues. So Colombia is very interesting to be able to address an economic treaty that allows us to make a safe transition without putting our economy and our people at risk in the process. But also with the responsibility that if we don't phase out fossil fuels, then of course climate will not stabilize, and also a country like Colombia is one of the most affected countries in the world. So we have that consciousness, we have that responsibility, we have made the initial scenarios and models, not only of the energy transition of Colombia, but of the economic transition of Colombia, and we realize it's very difficult to do it on our own. We need a multilateral agreement, we need to change the rules of the game of the financial system, and we need the cooperation and solidarity of the world to set the rules that are at the scale of the situation of the crisis, and if we are serious about following the advice of science. This is why we are promoting the treaty. Now, when we talk to other countries, they are surprised by the idea, they are open to the idea, but not necessarily ready to make the first step. We like to use this press conference to say that actually the treaty will be built by the countries that are at the center. Some of the feedback has been that they would like, some countries have told us they would like technological processes and transfer to be part of the treaty. I think that's very interesting. Countries like ours would like actually to see some stable markets and prices of oil in time, so that we can make the transition with a secure financial stability, because we are also victims of the flows of price in oil and gas. And countries are seeing, are starting to see, if we create interdependencies between economies, and we can secure a period where we can stabilize prices of oil and gas within the economies, we can make an economic pact and start making the transition. This is if I describe it as if you are Tarzan in the jungle and you are on one rope and you want to jump to the other rope, you need to have the other rope ready. And to be able to have that ready, we need to make this international cooperation process. So in summary, we see that a treaty that is not only legally binding regarding the targets, but actually provide the means, the real economic transition process and the means to be able to create the conditions for that transition is essential. Otherwise, the pledges that was made at COP, and especially on the Convention on Climate Change, do not have any, they don't have any real support to make that transition. And or some will make the concessions, and others, like Colombia, could potentially actually see their economies be ruined in a matter of 10, 15 years.
Finally, I had a chance to interview Tzeporah Berman herself about the treaty, particularly the financial, tax, and economic instruments to facilitate a phase-out. She also speaks about the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives in the treaty and is actively working with Juan Bay and the Waorani Nation. Tzeporah, thank you for speaking with me today. So we heard the Colombian environment minister talk about debt and how it stands in the way of countries such as Colombia from transitioning off of fossil fuels. Can you elaborate on how the treaty addresses this hurdle?
We are right now working with lawyers, economists from around the world, but specifically a large group from the Global South, to look at proposals under the treaty that would lead to debt relief to keep carbon in the ground, but also to restructuring trade and tax agreements so they would remove some of the barriers to stopping expansion of fossil fuels. These proposals will be presented to the bloc of nations that are now starting to design the fossil fuel treaty in Azerbaijan at their ministerial, and the treaty will move forward with trying to create these new proposals that are going to help countries address some of these issues. The fact is that escalating debt is part of what is keeping a lot of countries who understand that we need to be phasing out fossil fuels from doing that. And, we are talking to many countries who are looking at new oil drilling and new coal mining just to feed their debt. And that has to be relieved. There's no silver bullet. It's going to take a while to figure out the answer to these questions, but we've convened groups of experts who are now working on it.
And so in the proposed actions in this treaty, there's economic suggestions or actions. And so I'd like to ask you about these because I think they're really important and they warrant some explanation. So the suggestions include removing fossil fuel producer subsidies. How much money is that? And is there a mandate to redirect these subsidies?
Well, total in fossil fuel subsidies right now around the world, the IMF is reporting that it was $7 trillion this year, which is about $13 million a minute. That is increased from the year previous, which is very strange considering the majority of wealthy countries have committed years ago to phase out fossil fuels. How much of that is producer subsidies is about probably direct producer subsidies is closer to about $80 billion a year. And one of the critical pieces in constraining fossil fuel production is getting rid of those subsidies. So again, how the treaty will do that is up to the nation states who are currently negotiating it and designing it, but we're putting a number of options in front of them.
And so those could be possibly redirected, correct?
And should be redirected. The idea that right now, when the planet's on fire, we're using public taxpayer money to support the most profitable companies on Earth is absurd. Fossil fuel companies have made $2.8 billion in pure profits a day, every day for the last 50 years. And right now, our governments, especially wealthy governments in Canada, the US, Australia, Norway, and the UK, are subsidizing these oil and gas companies to continue to dig up stuff that we know we can't burn if we want to meet our climate goals and stay safe.
You want to introduce fees and taxes for fossil fuel production and export and increase royalties. How can that be mandated through this treaty? How would that work?
Ultimately, those things have to be mandated and regulated at a national level. But in order for countries to ensure that they don't lose their competitive advantage, for them to start to do it simultaneously, there needs to be agreements with it between countries to do it.
Just a question that I thought off the top of my head. So like in Australia, we have LNG exports and they pay little to no royalties on that, whereas countries like Norway and Qatar pay substantially more. So already it seems like there's room to do that even without the treaty.
So there are numerous possibilities under trade agreements where you could have levies, taxes for products coming in and out of countries. We have to be really careful about doing this kind of initiative because we need to make sure that we're supporting people and taxing polluters. And that's why that you have to be very careful with anything that the oil and gas companies are going to roll down to the consumer. For decades, the fossil fuel industry has been fear-mongering around price and scarcity in order to make people believe that we are dependent on fossil fuels, when in fact we could be producing cleaner and safer and cheaper energy that's owned by more people and less concentrated with renewable energy. And so that's what we need to try and figure out how to incentivize. So we need to design our policies and our reforms so we're creating social reforms to support people while increasing the taxes and the regulations on the oil and gas companies.
So we also heard Juan Bay speak on behalf of the Waorani Nation endorsing this treaty. Can you talk about the significance of this endorsement and how you plan to incorporate Waorani perspectives and other Indigenous perspectives into the treaty?
It's absolutely critical that we see a diverse endorsement from around the world, and especially of Indigenous peoples. Part of the situation we find ourselves in, where we are literally dealing with fires and floods that are sweeping the planet and lethal humidity, is because industrial society refused to listen to Indigenous people, not just about what they think should happen, but about what they value. What the Waorani people have been teaching us is about valuing life and living systems. And our economic structures, our trade structures, our tax structures, our treaties need to value life and living systems. So we don't have all the answers, but real reconciliation and decolonization is about listening and about trying to figure out new answers. And that's what we're going to be trying to do.
So we currently have 10 Indigenous nations, 13 governments endorsing this treaty. What are the next steps right now? What are you trying to accomplish now?
We also have thousands of organizations, Indigenous organizations, civil society organizations, faith organizations, health organizations. So we are building this movement from the ground up. When you study other treaties, landmines, chemical weapons, nuclear, non-proliferation, these treaties were built from the ground up. We're by cities. We have 113 cities from Calcutta to Vancouver to LA that have all endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. Subnationals, California passed a motion to endorse the treaty in the Senate and in the House. So this is a broad campaign, now somewhere over 3,500 organizations in 117 countries. So we're going to be building the campaign and the public communications, but simultaneously we're building the research base and the infrastructure to provide ideas that are groundbreaking to the countries that are endorsing the treaty. And then there's a diplomatic initiative where we're supporting those countries to meet with other nations. For example, here at the United General Assembly, the UNGA here in New York, and encourage them to step up and join them in developing a fossil fuel treaty. Because we can't forget that we're in the dire situation we're in because of the political influence and power of the fossil fuel industry. And if governments are going to stand up to the fossil fuel industry and start to constrain their production so we can let safer alternatives thrive, then we need governments to stand together. And we believe that by the end of the year we can have 20 countries, and many treaties were negotiated. The beginnings of those treaties were negotiated with 20 countries or less.
Tzeporah Berman, thank you so much for speaking with me, and have a great Climate Week.
Thank you very much. Nice to speak with you.
My last recording stop on the trip was a reception at Penn Plaza hosted by Amazon Watch and the Rainforest Action Network, where Indigenous activist Mohamed Nasheed of the Waorani Nation was in attendance. Nasheed's new memoir, We Will Be Jaguars, was available, and I picked up a copy. I hope to give it a review in the future. After the remarks were delivered at the reception, the group of Indigenous activists led the crowd in a song. If you want to read more on any of the material covered in this special podcast episode on Climate Week, you can find links to Land is Life, Honey Guide, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Nemonte Nankimo's memoir listed in the show notes. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay Newscast or any of our podcast content, and you want to help us out, we encourage you to spread the word about the work that we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is the best way to help expand our reach. But you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Mongabay is a non-profit news outlet, so that means even $1 per month makes a difference. It helps us offset production costs. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. But you can also read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or you can follow us on social media. Find Mongabay via our accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News and on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. And thank you, as always, for listening.